Great. Thanks for being here once again. And we have a lot to talk about. I mean, right now we have the elections coming up, and we've been seeing chaos throughout the mainstream media. I mean, everything is just happening all at once in the last 3 weeks. As we approach the elections and as, things start to really heat up now because we only have a couple days left, do you think the deep state is going to lose control of the system? Do you think we're on that path right now? And you think they're very worried about this?
Well, they're definitely very worried. That's why we've had this Operation Chaos thrown into the election campaign. I mean, I've never seen anything like this with the fake pipe bombs, the massacre at the synagogue, the way the Kavanaugh case unfolded, the number of other things, the Khashoggi murder. There's just a what you would call a cacophony of events, all of which are designed to negatively affect the support of Donald Trump. With the media saying that Trump is responsible for these actions. In fact, you might say they're overplayed because when there's this much with the same intent, you begin to wonder if maybe this was deliberately set up false flags. And I think a lot of people are beginning to suspect that, and there probably is some truth to it. But I think the important thing, Dave, is that there are two aspects to this. One is I don't have a forecast for what's going to happen in the election on November 6th. I think what we've seen is a desperate effort of a dying system to try to distort the election process in such a way as to carry out what they couldn't do with the Mueller investigation, which is to set up the conditions for the impeachment of Trump. But I think the other part of this is that we've seen Trump emerge as a very different kind of president in the last 6 to 8 weeks. The way he very much forced the Republican Party, which is not really his party. I mean, he's been opposed by these rhinos from the beginning. But he used the Kavanaugh hearings in such a way that the Republicans had to come out and support him. And he's now planning for the post-election period. Regardless of what happens on November 6th, he's going to pursue what he set out to pursue, namely the November 11th meeting with Putin, the November 30th meeting with Xi Jinping, a follow-up meeting with Kim Jong-un, inviting Putin to come to Washington sometime early next year. He's essentially saying, I'm the president. I'm going to do what I said I was going to do. And if you vote for me, great. If not, I'm not going to let the deep state set the agenda. And I think that's the most important thing. And my message to people who want to know, well, what should they do on November 6th? Vote Republican. Not because, as you know, I'm not a Republican. I don't support the Republican Party. But I support the war against the deep state, against the British operations that were coordinated with the FBI, the CIA, the Obama intelligence community, the Clinton networks. I'm totally committed to defend Donald Trump against that operation. And if we can break the power of the deep state, then we can see significant changes in the period immediately ahead, no matter what happens on November 6th.
What do you think the deep state is most afraid of with Trump? I mean, I know with the mainstream media, they put out, oh, he's a racist, he's a white nationalist. I mean, they're playing on people's emotions and they're using emotional terms to try to get people all riled up. But at the heart of it, what are they most afraid of? Why are they afraid of him being in the White House?
One thing they're not afraid of is Trump being a fascist, because they've supported fascists before. The New York Times supported Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. They supported Bush's lying that led to wars. All this stuff about Trump's a liar, Trump's a liar. What about Bush and Cheney on Iraq? What about Obama on Syria? What about Obama on Libya? Obama on Ukraine? These were presidents who lied to carry out wars. What about the Bush-Obama policy for the surveillance state? So this idea that somehow Trump is such a threat to our democracy is a complete fraud. What they're afraid of is that he isn't playing by the old rules. And the two most significant areas of this are his unwillingness to take up this Obama-Clinton provocation against Russia and China. Look, he's got some problems now dealing with Russia and China, which were largely caused by the whole Russiagate operation. But he is still committed to breaking the policy of regime change and wars. And that's something that the intelligence community and the British oppose completely. They don't want that change. Secondly, I think they're terrorized that if Trump actually forges a collaborative relationship with Putin and Xi Jinping, and by the way, he spoke with Xi Jinping just yesterday, and they had a very good conversation, and Trump came out afterwards and said, look, we still have good chemistry. We're going to work these things out. I think what they're afraid of is dramatic shift in economic policy, including the possibility of Trump turning on the Federal Reserve. I hope people paid attention to his attacks on Jerome Powell, not because they were attacks on Powell, but the way the Federal Reserve has a sense of an independent power above the elected officials of this country to make policy. And if he takes that up in conjunction with working with China on the Belt and Road Initiative, working with Russia in countering terrorism, all the idols of the post-war period, all the structures put in place to benefit the most wealthy financial swindlers in the world, all of it breaks down. And it's a whole new ballgame then. And that's why they fear Trump.
I just want to go, you mentioned Xi Jinping, and I want to go back to that for a sec here. You know, the corporate media, they're out there always saying that, you know, his tariffs and everything that he's putting into place, his economic policies, they're going to destroy the economy. And of course, right now we see the economy booming. And we know there's a lot of manipulation behind this, same manipulation that was there before Trump. And I think he's just using this to his advantage right now. But with China, do you think what he's doing here is he's trying to even out the playing field for when this system has to be reset? Because, you know, like you said, if we get rid of the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and we're no longer on that type of system, we really don't have manufacturing. We really don't have incredible trade deals with all these different countries. Is that his plan?
I think so. I think that he gave some indications during the 2016 campaign when he spoke about Glass-Steagall. He attacked the idea of the hedge funds setting the agenda, the shadow banking system. And then he's been pretty cautious on that since he's been in office. Now, maybe part of it was because he had Mnuchin and Gary Cohn from Goldman Sachs there. But I think it had more to do with Trump feeling that he had to break free of this Russia scenario, the Russiagate narrative, number one. Number two, establishing relations with Putin and Xi Jinping. You know, in spite of the efforts to portray him as a Manchurian candidate being blackmailed by Putin using this dossier from Christopher Steele that claims that Trump was caught in very dangerous sexual escapades by Putin on video. You know, in spite of all that, he's continuing to talk about the wonderful meeting he had in Helsinki and the importance of that. Even as he's talking about leaving the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, even as he's talking about escalating the tariffs on China, he's still anxious and desiring to meet and work with the leaders. I think his real target is not Russia and China, but it's NATO. And he said this explicitly a number of times, and the European Union, number one. Secondly, I think it's the World Trade Organization and the global banksters. He's made that clear on several occasions. And so I think negotiating position, look, we do have a trade deficit with China that's big. It's actually growing now in spite of the tariffs, which is not surprising because the policy so far has not been one that actually fully defends and invests in manufacturing and entrepreneurial operations in the United States. He's going to have to get control of the banking system to do that, which means he has to take on the Federal Reserve. So I think behind these problems that have emerged, including the ones with China, I think between now and November 30th, there's going to be very serious discussion between the United States and China. Larry Kudlow said that the other day. Kudlow said, look, we don't know what's going to happen for sure. We don't know if China will make a deal, but if they do, we can drop these tariffs right away. So I think we're going to see some very interesting developments during the month of November. And again, I think Trump is moving in this direction, regardless of what happens in the vote. And look, one thing that very few people have had a chance to do is actually read the transcripts of what Trump is saying on these election campaign visits he's making. What we hear about is the so-called outrageous charges, whether it's about the caravan or whether it's about the media. We hear a lot about that. But we don't hear what he's saying to the voters. He's telling them, I like Putin. I like Xi Jinping. Yeah, we got some rough spots. We're going to get through it. He's telling them, I did what I said I was going to do against free trade. We've got a lot more coming. He's telling them, we're not going to go to the Paris Climate Conference because the man-made climate change argument is a fraud. So he's very direct in his discussion with his constituents. And we're not hearing that because the mainstream media is too busy trying to prove that Trump is a neo-Nazi, racist, anti-woman, anti-Hispanic lunatic.
You mentioned the mainstream media where they're continually, like Trump says, using fake news and trying to kind of take out what he's saying. They're creating noise. But what happens when everything starts to fall into place, when, Trump meets Putin, he meets with Xi Jinping, they make a deal, and all of a sudden everything starts to fall into place. Those people are arrested who need to be arrested. And people look at the mainstream media then and say, well, wait a minute, you've been telling us one thing and now something completely opposite is happening. Isn't the mainstream media worried about losing all trust from the American people?
Well, I think they're making a big bet that that's not going to happen. But the fact is that a growing section of the population now believes that Trump is right when he talks about the fake news media, CNN, the Washington Post, the failing New York Times. The New York Times just had a defense of George Soros the other day, of all people. And what's interesting, I don't know if you saw it, but they said that the original anti-Soros initiative came from Lyndon LaRouche. Now, we did identify Soros back in the late 70s as a swindler who was operating on behalf of the City of London to destroy the dollar at the time, working with the International Monetary Fund and others. So the New York Times took a big risk. They came out and for the first time in 20 years mentioned the name Lyndon LaRouche. I think they're doubling down with the belief that they're going to win the November 6th election and they're going to be able to get Trump. Now, here's the deeper issue. If the mainstream media wins, if the coup succeeds, we will probably end up in World War III during 2019. Because the Russians are preparing as though they will have to fight a war against us. So are the Chinese. And it's not because of Trump. Putin and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, have been clear on this. They're saying that there are forces running the administration outside of Trump's control who are committed to war, so therefore the Russians have to prepare for that. Now, it's ironic, given that the Democratic Party used to be known as the Peace Party, that if the Democratic Party succeeds, we're going to have the biggest war in world history. And it's because the Democratic Party has given up every pretense of representing the interests of the forgotten men and women of this country for the sake of power and money. Now, the other point, though, and I think this is another important one, the Republican Party has been changed in the last 6 to 8 weeks, maybe the last 4 months. You see it in someone like Lindsey Graham, who when John McCain was still allegedly alive, Lindsey Graham was clinging to McCain's skirts and attacking Trump all the time. Now he's come out as a much more forceful defender of the president. We saw that in the Kavanaugh case. So I think Trump has done a very skillful job of moving the Republican Party. Now that brings us back to this question of the media. You know, I'm not in the United States a lot, but I do a lot of media and interviews in the U.S. and get a lot of questions on some of these radio shows from average listeners. And I would say that the disgust at the media is higher than I've ever seen. In fact, the disgust with the mainstream media is about as high as it is with the disgust for Congress or the disgust with Hillary Clinton. So I think we're seeing a very dramatic phase shift here, Dave, and I think this will play out as we move into the last 2 years of Trump's first term.
If the deep state and the Democrats, they get control of the House, you're saying that we're going to be moving into a war. I mean, do they have that much power to bring us to war, or does Trump have the ability to stop it? You don't think Trump has gained enough power, because I know the military is behind him, that we will not enter war?
Well, it's tricky, because if the Democrats take the House, they're going to control the committees. And that means they're going to shut down the investigation of the deep state. Look, one of the most remarkable things in the last, especially this last year, has been the degree to which people like Nunes and Trey Gowdy and Getz and a group of these guys, Jim Jordan, have turned the spotlight on Mueller, Comey, Brennan, the deep state operatives, and then on the British. Now, I'm sure you remember, because you and I have been talking about this for years. The LaRouche organization has maintained that the biggest threat to American sovereignty comes from the United Kingdom, from the intelligence services and from the City of London. And from the very beginning, we were saying if you want to break the coup, you have to show the role of GCHQ, the British equivalent of the NSA. You have to look at what Christopher Steele, who he is, who he's working for, Sir Richard Dearlove, the man who lied to create the Iraq War. You have to understand that. And now we're seeing a remarkable George Papadopoulos coming out saying, look, the whole Russiagate is a British sting operation. So I think this is something that one of the most important reasons why people should make sure the Republicans hold the House. Because if the Democrats control these committees, Adam Schiff is going to have an avalanche of lies against Trump in the Intelligence Committee, as opposed to an exposure of who's running the coup. Now, as far as the war danger, look, I'm sure the Republicans are going to hold the Senate, which means that the likelihood of an impeachment in the House, there's a possibility, but it probably won't get the votes, the 2/3 votes needed in the Senate to throw Trump out. What they'll do is a steady drip of defamation and slander and try to demoralize the Republicans so that Trump can't do anything. I don't think it's going to work. I think, as Leslie Stahl, of all people, said, he's actually acting like a president. I don't know if you saw her comments after the 60 Minutes interview with him, but she said, he's the president. I could feel him having a sense of his power. And that's a change. The military, I think you're right, is on his side. James Mattis is on his side. I think there's a section of the intelligence community and a section of the FBI which is on his side. That's one of the reasons we're getting so many leaks about the corruption in these agencies. So I don't think the bloodbath that we've seen so far is going to end on November 6th, regardless of who wins. I think it's going to escalate, which is why the American people have to be in on the fight. This is not a spectator sport. This is our future. We've got to make sure that Trump has the backing of the American people to go out there and crush these enemies of our nation. And to me, that's the issue of war and peace. I don't think that Trump is going to launch a nuclear strike against Russia or China or North Korea or anyone. But I think the effort is going to be made to get him out of office so that whether it's Pence or whether it's some other conglomeration comes in there, that we'll go back to the Hillary Clinton policy, the Obama policy, which did have us on a course toward war.
Well, let's take the other side of the coin here. I mean, if the Republicans take the House, the deep state, the Dems, they lose control. And we know that Trump signed this declassification that went to the Department of Justice. Do you think all of that's going to move forward, and all these indictments that everyone is talking about, do you think that's going to move forward if the Republicans take the House?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's interesting that Trump hasn't made a big deal out of the declassification being stalled, and he hasn't made a big deal about Rod Rosenstein not appearing before the congressional hearings. Why? Trump had a meeting with Rosenstein, and I think there was some kind of agreement that was made that Trump essentially said to Rosenstein, you're either going to come clean or this whole thing's going to blow up. I'll blow it up. And I think after the election, there's no reason for Trump to hold back. And so you have the declassification process, which will show that the existing president, the president of the United States, Barack Obama, was involved in an operation with a presidential campaign of Hillary Clinton, working with a foreign power, the City of London and British intelligence, to try to defeat a presidential candidate and then to try and throw him out of office after he won the election. This is, as Joe DeGeneva says, much, much bigger than Watergate. And I think with the documentation being presented in these declassifications and so on, the FISA warrants, the FBI interviews of various people, I think as this comes forward, people like John Brennan are going to have to find a hole to crawl into to protect themselves. So I think the possibility of breaking apart, doing what John Kennedy said should have been done to the CIA in 1962, or 61 after the Bay of Pigs, it should have been broken up into 1,000 pieces. I think we're going to see that potential under Donald Trump. And that's why I say that it's so critical that the American people not fall into pessimism or spectatoritis, but be in the fight right up through the November 6th election and then continue after that to make sure that we can take our country back.
Let me get your opinion on this. So if the declass does happen and it shows that Obama, Clinton, and the whole gang, they were, all in on this corruption. They were spying on Trump. They were selling secrets to the Chinese. And this does come out. This is going to rock the nation. I mean, especially those people that haven't really been paying attention.
Yeah.
This country is going to, people are not going to believe this at all.
Well, I think that's a problem you have because too many people are trapped in fantasy football and various kinds of media-induced stupors. But, reality has a way of having an effect in breaking people out of that. And, I think the FISA warrants themselves will show that the FISA court, which was functioning as a completely secret arm of the deep state to target Americans illegally, under the FISA mandate, they're not allowed to target Americans. So what do? They go get the British to do the work. GCHQ is intercepting signals. The Five Eyes, Alexander Downer, the Australian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, is planting stories on George Papadopoulos. This is a hard story to believe if you haven't been following it closely. And I think that once it starts coming out, people are going to have an insatiable desire to find out what really went on. Was Obama really that corrupt? And, I think you remember when Obama left office, his popularity was pretty low. And it went up because of all the attacks on Trump. And people said, well, Obama wasn't that bad. Obama was horrible. He was taking us on a course toward war and dictatorship. And the fact that he authorized illegal intelligence operations against a presidential campaign, that goes much beyond anything Nixon was ever accused of. And I think you're right, Dave. This is going to cause a real shock, but it should, because our government has been in the hands of people who are criminals. Now, also, that's why I say you have to have an economic component here. That, we see elements of the economy that are doing well, and that people say, well, this is a real recovery, but we still have not had a significant uptick in manufacturing. Wages are still lagging behind. We've not yet broken, we're in a terrible situation regarding debt. Public and private debt is up 60% since 2008. It's unsustainable. And when people find out, you read in the paper that Jeff Bezos made or lost $12 billion in one day on the stock market, it's unbelievable. And people can't grasp that this is not about business or capitalism. This is thievery. This is swindles, Ponzi schemes, sanctioned by the government because the private banks, through the Federal Reserve and through the City of London, control the governments. So as this story gets out, if it's told properly, I think the American people are going to follow it really closely and be astounded at what we've put up with these last 20 years.
At the beginning, when we were first talking, you mentioned the Federal Reserve and how Trump is out there contradicting the Federal Reserve. And you really haven't seen a president do this in a very, very long time. And he even went as far to say that, if the economy implodes on itself, the Federal Reserve is to blame. I mean, from my point of view, it seems like he's setting up the Federal Reserve to take the blame for all of this.
Well, and he's right to do so, because the quantitative easing policy, which created the stock market bubble, which, Trump is basically saying now that the stock market is showing the real economy is growing, but it's not. It's still a bubble. But more importantly, by making the Federal Reserve an issue for public discussion, he is setting it up. And you're right. No recent president, I think Reagan once said something about the Federal Reserve. He attacked Volcker. But the last person,
and he was shot.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
The last person who really took on the Federal Reserve was John Kennedy in June 1963 with an executive order establishing treasury bills because the Fed was not providing credit to industry. And he was shot. Laura, I think that's one of the main reasons they did kill Kennedy. So Trump is taking on the shadow government, whether you want to call it the deep state, the intelligence community, the military industrial complex. He's taking it on. And I get really angry at people who say, well, he's got Bolton, he's got Nikki Haley, he's got Mnuchin, he's got all these bad guys, he's doing bad things. Well, hell, he's fighting the worst bunch of criminals and power-hungry maniacs the world has ever seen. And he's fought them to a standstill with the entire media against him. And he started to expose them so that the Congress was able to have the guts to start telling the truth about who's running Russiagate. The only thing the Congress hasn't done, the Republicans in Congress, is tell you why this is being done. It's not just against Donald Trump. It's against Trump's breaking with the Washington consensus, the London consensus, the neocon, neoliberal policy. And this is astonishing, because who would have thought that the person who would step forward to fight these criminals would be Donald Trump? If you go back in a time machine to 2015 when Trump first announced, who would have predicted we'd be in this situation today? But one of the things he's done is he's polarized in the right way so that people now see who are the enemies of this country, who are against the idea of loving America, Who's against the idea that the government of the United States should fight for the interests of the people of the United States? Well, it's the mainstream media. It's the Clinton Democrats. It's the Bush neocon Republicans. So Trump has given us a roadmap. And even if he's made some bad decisions, and I don't agree with everything he's done, but I think on the whole, he should be defended as someone who's shown the courage to do what no president has done, including Kennedy, to openly come out and identify the enemies of the country.
He had to navigate through a community, an intelligence community, the Democrat community, the neocon community, where they have been embedded in this system for a very long time, infiltrating everything. And he had to step into this where everyone was against him, like you said, the mainstream media against him, everyone in the almost everyone in the FBI, the CIA, NSA, you name it, they're all against him. And he had to turn everything around. I mean, that is a very difficult task. I mean, think about a new manager coming into an office and saying, okay, we're going to, create something new. We're going to change everything. Everyone normally fights against that one manager because they don't like change. He had to come in and change everything. And it's a very difficult task. And it doesn't happen with the snap of a finger. It's completely impossible, especially if you want to indict people, bring people up to military courts or to civilian courts. You have to change out all the judges. You have to change out everything because most of these people are corrupt, and it's a very long, drawn out process. And I think some of the moves that he made, I think he's done it on purpose to get around certain obstacles and then come back to it and then say, okay, now I don't need that anymore. Let's move forward with this. And I think it's a very difficult process. And I think he's done a great job up to this point.
The metaphor of draining the swamp has a certain kind of fluidity to it. But the actual process of draining a swamp is not an easy thing to do, especially when the swamp is filled with alligators and poisonous snakes. And especially when you're there alone, maybe in a canoe or with a machete. And what we're seeing is an emergence of a political awakening, which really goes back to the Obamacare debate in 2010, where a lot of people suddenly realized that this is not just a question of a policy difference, but a question of a completely different paradigm being presented by the Democrats. And the key thing in Obamacare, people said, well, it's government takeover of healthcare. It's worse than that. It was an attempt to use the healthcare system to kill off Americans. That was what Obamacare was about. And very few people would say that. And to have the courage to come out and say that, this is one of the reasons people said, oh, LaRouche, he's so negative. He's so conspiratorial. Well, we were right about Obamacare. It was designed to limit the healthcare capabilities of most Americans. Now, similarly, when we talk about the Hillary Clinton war policy, Trump was absolutely right when he said that if Hillary's elected, we're going to be in war with Russia. Hillary's idea of a no-fly zone over Syria, when the Russians were already in Syria, and on top of that, what were the Russians doing in Syria? Fighting the terrorists we claimed we were fighting. And then you get Michael Flynn, the inconvenient character who was exposing the fact that under Obama, the CIA and the intelligence community was arming Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so what happens to Flynn? He's indicted. Then you have Paul Manafort. What was Manafort's contribution to the Trump campaign? Besides managing the convention, he went to the platform committee and got them to put Glass-Steagall into the Republican platform, which was an anti-Wall Street measure. And then he got them to take out the support for lethal weapons to the fascist government of Ukraine. So Manafort is targeted on this bogus tax and lobbying charges, when the reality is they wanted to get rid of him because he knows exactly that under Obama, the United States was supporting neo-Nazi thugs who run the security operation of the Ukrainian government. So All of these things were supposed to be covered up because Hillary was going to win. Now, Hillary didn't win. So what do? They get Mueller in there to indict Flynn, to indict Manafort, and to go after Trump. And now after 2 years and millions of dollars, who knows how much time and energy spent on it, they've come up with nothing. No collusion, no Russian meddling, a few indictments here and there on process charges, lying to the FBI. So what we're seeing is a defensive, hysterical reaction to stop a dynamic, which is not just in the United States, Dave. This is the other thing that's important. Look what's happening in Europe now. The Brexit is falling apart because the City of London doesn't want to have it go through. And they're trying to reverse the vote of the people of the United Kingdom. Look at what's happening in Italy and Austria. A full-scale, all-out rebellion against the European Union's fascist economic and banking policies. Look at Germany. The Merkel government is set to collapse. Merkel had to give up the chairmanship of the Christian Democratic Union. She claims she's going to stay till the end of her term in 2021. I don't think that's possible. Her party is collapsing the same way the political parties in France and Italy and other countries are disappearing. So we're seeing a global rebellion against a bankrupt, corrupt, evil establishment. And you can't stop that by lying about the people who suddenly say, I don't like the Clintons. I don't like being told that I'm a deplorable. And the main thing is to make sure that the people who are targeted get the information as to who's targeting them and why. And to the extent Trump has done that, he's empowered maybe 30% of the American population, the hardcore Trump supporters, who are the ones who are studying now the British role, studying the Clintons, studying what Obama was doing. Imagine if we got that to 50% of the population of this country knowing who was the real enemy of the United States. That's the revolution. And that's the revolution that's coming, regardless of what happens November 6th.
Yeah, that's what I think what they're most afraid of, the people waking up and realizing, because the people are their biggest threat.
Absolutely. And all you have to do is look at the election eve broadcast from 2016, and they're rubbing their eyes, the deer in the headlight look. How did this happen? Why didn't we know? Well, they didn't know because they believed their lies. And I think they believe them again. And again, I'm not making a prediction, but I think this idea that the blue wave is going to sweep over everything, unless there's massive fraud run through the National Security Agency and the real meddlers, I think we're going to have somewhat of a standoff on November 6th. And then the real fight is going to begin. And as I said, Trump is moving ahead with his agenda. I think he's got to broaden it now, take up the economic questions. I think his meetings with Putin and Xi Jinping are crucial. Also with Kim Jong-un. Look, the people who were accusing Trump of threatening North Korea and maybe leading us toward nuclear war now are saying that Trump is too nice to Kim Jong-un. And we may have a significant shift on the Korean Peninsula. We already have had it. But a significant shift that occurred because Trump worked with Russia, China, Japan, and South Korea, something that Obama didn't do, that Bush didn't do, and that Hillary Clinton wouldn't have done. We could have an accelerated Trump-Putin collaboration to crush the remnants of terrorism, including who are the supporters of terrorism. The Saudis have generally gotten away scot-free on this. In fact, Mueller and Comey covered up the Saudi connections with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But, what's happening in Saudi Arabia right now, who knows what's going to come forward in terms of the Saudi role in supporting terrorism. So I really think there's a global revolution underway. And instead of being disappointed that your pet issue is not being addressed by Trump, join the revolution. Let's overthrow this corrupt system and bring about a revival of the American system of physical economy, of a banking system which is not controlled by a few private individuals, but actually is committed to directing credit to physical production, to infrastructure development, to scientific and technological progress, because that's what made our nation strong. And if we get back to that, the deep state is going to be, you might say, in deep six. Deep six.